Hello and welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show. I'm your host Mark Philpott, and on this show I talk to people from all across the world about their inspiring travel stories. Today is no exception. I'm talking to a man who probably knows more about luxury travel than anybody else on the planet. He's been in the travel industry for over 30 years and he has one of the most successful travel blogs about luxury travel. Why don't we get on and meet my guest for today's show? His name is Mr. Paul Johnson. Paul, welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show.
Thank you very much.
How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, we've got blue skies here for a change, so that's always makes for a pleasant start to the day.
So, whereabouts are you speaking to us from in the world today?
So, I'm based in a town called on the edge of a town called Kendal, which is between the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales National Parks in the UK.
Oh, I know it very well. I've ridden my bicycle around Lake Windermere, which is up around that area.
That's just 10 minutes drive away from here. In fact, my children go to school in Windermere. So.
Oh, very good. Okay, well, yeah. I for one know exactly where you are, and you've got sunshine today, so that's a bonus, isn't it, this time of the year?
Yes, I mean, it's we've had our fair share of rain the last few weeks, as the Lake District often gets. So, yeah, nice blue skies always a bonus.
Have you been on many podcast shows before?
I've done a little section on one previously, and I must confess I can't even remember the name of it. It was a few years ago, but so it's not been that memorable. I must say, but I have been on one before.
Well, I hope I change that philosophy today, and you actually remember being on this show. Are you a person that listens to podcasts when you're traveling around?
I do sometimes. I sort of have phases on and off. I'll listen to sometimes. I used to. And I still do occasionally run quite a bit, and so I'd listen to them whilst running as a way to alleviate the boredom a little. So I'd quite a few comedy ones and things like that, BBC ones and so on.
You haven't had any accidents running, have you, when you run into a tree because you're listening to the podcast show?
Not yet.
Okay, great. Well, let's get on with it. The first thing I do with all of my guests on the show is I give you the opportunity to actually dedicate your episode to someone special in your life. So who would you like to dedicate this episode to today?
Oh, gosh, that's put me on the spot. I better dedicate it to my wife.
That's a very good idea. And what's your wife's name?
Becky.
Becky, okay. Well, Becky, this one's for you, and it's something that you and Paul are going to be able to look back on for years and years to come, that he was on the Global Travel Channel podcast show, and he dedicated the show to you. So there we go. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about luxury travel today, but before we do, I want to ask you, do you remember the first time you actually went on an overseas travel experience yourself?
From quite a young age, we used to go on family camping holidays to France pretty much every year until I was a teenager.
Oh, fantastic. Whereabouts in France did you go to?
Mostly to places like Brittany and Loire and those kinds of regions.
And did it give you an appetite for travel? Did you get to enjoy it more and more as the years went on and sort of saw yourself getting around the world at some stage?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. My birthday's in the summer, so invariably whenever we went away, I would have my birthday on holiday, and that was always really memorable and sort of very fun memories of doing that. And then when I was about 13, I think was the first time I ever went on a flight. It wasn't, I'm becoming an old man, nearly 50 now, and it wasn't commonplace for people to fly like they do nowadays. So that was quite an adventure, and that really sticks with me. 1984, I think it was, we went to Corfu as a family holiday, as a break from going to France each year. And yeah, I've always had a bug for travel and an interest in the world. My degree was in geography and geology, so I've always had an interest for what goes on around the world and a love for travel.
It was part of your DNA by the sound of it.
Well, yeah, it's just something I've grown up with, albeit just largely in my younger years, largely just trips to France, but then further afield within Europe, and then as I got older, further afield still.
What did you like in those early days of travel? What were the things that really resonated with you about traveling itself?
The journey itself, I remember we because we lived in the north of England, just near Manchester, and we used to get, I think, a ferry crossing sometime in the morning. I'm guessing something like 9 or 10 in the morning. So the adventure I very much remember as a kid I used to go to bed the night before and effectively wake up in mum and dad's car, just short of reaching Dover or something, and that always used to be very exciting because obviously I'd been lifted out of the bed and put in the car, and then suddenly we'd wake up and we'd all be on holiday and just about to go on the ferry and all that sort of thing. So I remember I have quite fond memories of the excitement of that and everything. So, yeah.
And what about the cultural significance of it? Can you remember what kind of impact it was the first time you went to France that you can really remember it?
I think the first time I was probably too young to really appreciate those differences. But as I grew up, obviously we'd be on campsites where there would be a mix of English and French people, and gradually I would be picking up bits of French here and there. And I remember I must have been about 8 or 9, and I was given a T-shirt which had front and back on it, and sleeve on each arm, and I used to wear it backwards to confuse the French people. So yeah, I was quite immature at the time, I suppose. So obviously I was becoming aware of language and cultural differences from that quite early age. And as I got older, I would certainly enjoy trying to order things in French and so on.
What was some of the things that you enjoyed the most about camping?
I think with something like camping, and although I obviously run a blog about luxury travel, it's something I still do to this day with my family. I think it's a great opportunity to spend good quality family time together, particularly nowadays, away from, I know you can't get away from them completely, but away from devices and distractions like that, and actually spend proper good quality family time together. And I think camping is one of those things that really allows you to do that away from Xboxes and televisions and so on.
Do you take your children to the places in France where you used to
go? We have been to Brittany together. I haven't specifically tried to go to say the same campsites or anything like that, but certainly been to the same regions and places like, in terms of attractions, places like Mont Saint-Michel as well. And I remember going to there with my kids and doing it as a child myself. So,
how do you think those early days of travel kind of changed you as a young boy? What kind of impact did it have in terms of understanding other places around the world?
I think although it's a very small snapshot, I think it gives you an awareness of there are differences out there that are different to your own day-to-day home life, and obviously it developed an awareness of that. And I remember as a kid having a sort of pictorial atlas and loving looking at that and seeing different places in the world and how different people lived. So I think you only truly get that. Yes, you can read books and so on, but you only truly get that experience by starting to travel yourself.
And was there a specific epiphany when you started getting interested in luxury travel? Was there something that happened specifically, or was it just a migration of your interest in travel?
I think it's two things. Partly a migration of me as I get older and enjoying a few more comforts and having a bit more disposable income to do that. Also, I've worked in the travel industry now for nearly 30 years. My parents, when they semi-retired, they took on a self-catering, or I think in Australia they call it a vacation rental business. Which was very high end for self-catering accommodation at the time. They won the what was called the England for Excellence Awards for self-catering accommodation across the whole of the country. So I was quite involved in that business, and that gave me an awareness of more the luxury end of the market and what's out there. And so yeah, it's just evolved over time, I would say, rather than any sort of single dawning moment.
Yeah. Now, you're the man behind the travel blog called A Luxury Travel Blog, and I'm going to put all the links to the blog in the show notes today so people can check it out and get in touch with you if they want to. I'm interested to know, though, because I was doing some research before the show, and there's lots of different variations and definitions out there on what luxury travel really is. So I'm interested to know, what is your definition of luxury travel?
Yeah, you're right. There's many different ways of perceiving luxury. And I think it's different things for different people. But for me, it's primarily about service and staff, and then the people that are serving you almost second guessing your needs and requirements without being over attentive at the same time. It's getting that delicate balance between providing a service and giving a kind of surprise and wow factor without being overly attentive.
Is it something, do you think, that evolves as one gets more mature and older in age?
Well, I think they say that as people get older, they become more stuck in their ways and so on. So I think people, as a general rule, become less forgiving and more expectant of levels of service. I'm generalizing grossly, but so I suspect that people in general can become more demanding. Whether that's quite answering your question, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's pretty close. So what was the story behind the creation of the blog? What inspired you to start it?
A couple of things, really. So I got married in 2003 and we went on honeymoon, and I really did push the boat out on that one because I only planned to do it once and I only have done it once. So yeah, we went on a really special safari to Tanzania, followed by staying at a few different places, and then finished it off with an island off the northeast coast of Zanzibar called Menemba Island. So we had a really special time, and it was really high end. So that was one sort. I suppose if going back to your mention of an epiphany moment, that was my sort of first true insight into what kind of luxury is out there. So that, coupled with, in 2004 we had our first son, and I actually set up a blog recording his early days and years, so that really family and friends could follow what he's up to, his first crawling and steps and words and things we got up to with him with photographs and so on. This was very early days of blogs even existing. And at the time, my job was basically doing web design and internet marketing for tourism businesses,
right? Largely
here in the Lake District and also further afield throughout the UK. So there were two things going on, really. I started to get quite interested in luxury travel, and blogging came along at about the same time, whilst I was still working in tourism marketing. So I was kind of, I suppose, three things all happening at once that kind of made me really start the blog as just a hobby in my lunch hour at first. That was the early days. I was just nipping out, getting a sandwich and coming back to my desk and thinking, oh, I'll just do a bit of Googling and see what I can find. And I just started writing about a few things that I was finding in the luxury travel news and so on. So.
It's amazing where things go, isn't it? 110.
It is, yeah.
110,000 unique visitors per month later. Did you ever imagine that you were going to get to those kinds of numbers?
It's more than that at the moment, actually. But so it's more like 130,000 at the moment.
Wow.
And yeah, I had no sort of preconceptions when I started. It was just a hobby thing. There were very few people blogging. In fact, the only other travel bloggers really that were out there, I would say, were largely people sort of backpacking maybe in Southeast Asia, just doing it really to record their adventures for people back home and things like that. There wasn't really anybody writing about luxury travel. So I guess that was a plus for me, that I was, at the time at least, I was doing something that nobody else was really doing. So that gave me a good sort of first footing, if you like.
What were some of the challenges with starting that blog up, and once you'd made a decision to focus on that niche area of travel, what were some of the challenges of getting the blog known to the marketplace?
In the early days, I would say it was just really about creating the content that, and because there was very little competition out there. So in many respects, I would say it became more challenging as time went on, and other people started to say, hey, I'm going to try my hand at blogging as well. I mean, nowadays, I don't know how many travel blogs are out there, but it's enormous. So it's actually just become increasingly competitive. So the challenges nowadays, I suppose they're the same, but they've become the competition's become fiercer, really.
I was reading that the luxury travel market is expected to reach $1.6 billion per year by 2026. Do you have any idea what it was when you started off?
I haven't, I'm afraid. Yeah, and when you talk of money, of sums like that, it's hard to get your head around, really.
It is, isn't it? I guess I asked you that because I guess there has been, and I'm saying this from a rather naive position, in terms of there must have been an explosion in the last 10 years of luxury in the luxury travel market.
Definitely, yeah. I think it is and I think it's continuing to grow and grow. So I do a weekly roundup of news, of luxury travel news each Sunday on my blog, just picking out about 5 different stories. And when I do the research to find which stories I'm going to pick, invariably I'm seeing reports of how the luxury travel market is continuing to expand all the time. So yeah, I think it has grown a lot in the last decade or two, and I think it will continue to grow. There just seems to be the demand out there.
What were some of the things that people gravitated towards that you were writing back in the early days about luxury travel? Was there a specific area within the luxury travel industry that people wanted certain information on?
So for me personally on the blog, I find, I know it's done to death, but these listicle style articles tend to perform very well. I think it's partly because the subject line is quite clickbaity, if you like. So when it goes out on your social media and people see top 10 places to stay in London or whatever, those articles seem to always perform well. I think people are curious as to see which hotels are featured and so on. But the other kinds of articles I would say do well would be the kind of ultra luxury, what you might say the more money than sense kind of luxury travel. So the very, very high end, that always seems to generate a huge amount of interest, as does anything that's very sort of topical and current. Also seems to get plenty of interest.
Now, you were getting all this going before social media took over the world. So how did you essentially get your blog out to the world in those days?
Yeah, so I forget the timings exactly, but I think Facebook was around at the time. So I set up a Facebook page and had one specifically for the blog. Twitter, I think, came along quite early on whilst I was doing the blog. And I don't know the exact timings for Twitter and so on. But I seem to remember I was only a year or two in and I'd heard about Twitter coming along. At first, I thought, oh gosh, this Twitter lark is a waste of time. People saying, hey, I'm waiting at a bus stop or whatever. And I didn't really see the point in it at all. And then I persevered with it for a while and I thought, oh, I could share 1 or 2 of my blog posts on this. And so I tried doing that and it was bringing me traffic. So I work quite hard to increase my Twitter following. And to this day, Twitter is where, out of all the social channels, where my main audience is. There's about 700,000 followers on Twitter. And so I must confess, just because there's not enough hours in the day, I don't engage on social media as much as I'd like to. But I do use it to broadcast content quite a lot, and it does bring quite a lot of traffic.
Did you spend more time when it first came out engaging with it, or has your strategy more or less stayed the same all the way through?
I perhaps spent more time in the earlier years. Now my battle really is keeping my inbox down. So I'm busy trying to, in a typical day, I'm busy trying to reply to emails and so on, and don't get as much time as I would like to spend on social media. Bearing in mind also I'm writing blog posts, and in my particular case, my blog is very different to what many people might perceive a travel blog to be. So typically a travel blog will be about that one person or a couple or a family and their travels, whereas mine's, although that is one component of my blog, it's not the main part of the blog, if you like. So the blog has had more than 700 different people contributed to it to date. And so we have a number of different people that write regularly from within the industry on the blog. So it's more like I would say it's more like a travel magazine than necessarily what many people might perceive a travel blog to be.
Did you ever think about actually turning it into a magazine rather than a blog?
I suppose in the very early days, it already kind of adopted that style. And bear in mind, this is a time when there weren't really any travel blogs, or very few travel blogs around. So there were no sort of hard and fast rules as a travel blog looked like this. So even in those early days, it was more like a magazine with occasionally interspersed by articles from my own travels. But again, that was always a small part of the whole blog.
Before we go any further, I just want to pass on my great appreciation to you today, because while I can't spouse off the huge numbers of followers that you've got over the last enormous amount of years that you've been doing this, I have reached my 100th episode today on my podcast show, and you're my 100th guest. So thank you very much for joining me to be my 100th guest.
Well, thank
today.
you, and congratulations.
It's a start, and I've put my toe into the ocean, so to speak. So we'll see where it goes from here.
Very much so, yeah.
Now, how did you get those contributors on board? What was the strategy behind, first of all, finding them? How did you find these people?
So they approached me, and they still approach me to this day. So they see the blog, and so this is what we would call guest blogging. So they write for the blog, and at the end of each article, much like you might have a signature on the end of an email, they have a signature on the end of their blog posts. So they see it as a way to generate awareness for their own businesses.
Right.
So they don't, the content that they write isn't about them and about their businesses. It's more peripheral, if you like, to what they do, but used as a means to indirectly promote their businesses. So let's say we have one small hotel in Provence, in the south of France, a lady called Sue Stevens. She has quite a small hotel, but she writes regularly about things to do in and around Provence as a way to promote her hotel. She also has a very high-end self-catering accommodation just a mile or so from the hotel as well.
So it really is a true collaboration of the industry experts, so to speak.
And very much so. I mean, to date, we have the blog has, I think about a year ago, got its 10,000th blog post. So we do have a lot of contributions. I would say 90% or more of the content is from people other than myself nowadays. So my role has become more of an editorial one, checking the content that's submitted to the site and approving it and so on.
I was going to ask you about that in terms of, you said earlier that you've worked in the travel industry for over 30 years. What kinds of things have you done within the travel industry?
So very early days, I used to help with my parents' self-catering business, particularly when they used to go away on holiday. So they used to go away more like November, January time, because that's when the holiday cottages were quieter, and they would go places like South Africa to enjoy a bit of winter sun. And I would look after their business whilst they were away, even though I was actually still studying at university at the moment. I was doing a PhD.
Right.
So they would get the telephone diverted to me, and actually January in particular was a time when bookings would be very busy. It's typically in the travel industry, it is a time when it's a high booking period because people have maybe just spent time with family over Christmas and so on, and they're planning their year ahead, making their plans for where they're going to go. So I was actually quite busy from university, doing my day-to-day work, and then on an evening listening to answering machine messages and phoning people back, dealing with their bookings and some of this was in the very early days of email, so I was putting sort of brochures in the post and things like that. So so I was quite heavily involved in that. And then in my later years at university, there was a small tourism body in the Lake District, specifically looking after what we call here the Furness and Cartmel Peninsulas. It covers sort of Ulverston across to Barrow and Cartmel as well. I don't know if those are places that some listeners may have heard of.
I'm sure.
And they produced a leaflet which I used to distribute all over the Lake District to hotels and B&Bs and guest houses. And actually the early days of my own business were half leaflet distribution and half internet marketing. So obviously, as I mentioned, I ended up in the early days of the internet. This is, I think we're going back to about 1993 when I created my first website. In fact, the very first one was for my parents' self-catering business, and it was, even though they got a high number of repeat visitors, suddenly they were getting a huge amount of bookings online, because again, there weren't many people online in those early days. So they were getting bookings from all over the world, when normally much of their trade might have been UK specific. That led on to me doing the website for Cumbria Tourist Board, which is now known as Cumbria Tourism, which is the tourism governing body for the Lake District here. This is one of the most visited national parks in the UK, and recently named a World Heritage Site. So a very popular area with tourists. I think it's the second most visited place in the UK after London, actually.
Right.
Certainly very popular, particularly with those enjoying the outdoors and so on. It's very picturesque here.
Well, the Tour of Yorkshire cycling event is becoming a massive thing now, isn't it, in that area?
It is. It's huge, yeah. And there is a Tour of Britain cycling event as well, which I think starts in Scotland and ends down south somewhere. And one leg of that actually finishes in Kendal here. So that's always a huge and popular event as well. So.
No, I was going to ask you, it's really interesting listening to you talk about the evolution of these activities that you've been involved in the industry, because whether it be your own blog site or helping your parents out in the early days, getting their website up and running, you were very much a pioneer in the space. Do you think it was harder then starting off and doing things than it would be today with all the different competition out there? What do you think would be more difficult?
I think in some respects it was harder, in so much as there wasn't software to help you code a web page, for example. I literally used to do it by hand, just in Notepad, even creating tables and things like that. So that aspect was harder. But one thing I would say was easier then was things like the marketing. If you wanted to rank well for Lake District Holiday Cottage, well, there were very few online in those early days. So you just really had to create the website, mention those words, and hey presto, you were on the first page of Yahoo, I think it was then, or Alta Vista. It wasn't even Google in those days. So certain aspects were easier, and then other aspects were harder. And now I would say there's been a big shift in that nowadays it's much easier to create a website. There's so many tools out there and sort of WYSIWYG things that will help you do that. But the marketing's a lot harder because everybody's in on the game and you've got to get seen, so there's a lot more to know with SEO, and in fact the algorithms to rank well with the likes of Google have become more and more sophisticated and complicated and so on.
I imagine you're a man that enjoys that type of thing, though, in terms of delving deep into the back end of that social media algorithms and finding out how to conquer it all. Is that true?
Well, I certainly like to get my blog up there and get it seen. So, I mean, I would argue that that's as much important, if not more so, than the obviously it's important that you have good quality content, but you really need that good quality marketing to go with it. I mean, there's no point having a great blog with amazing stories and so on if nobody's seeing it. So the two go hand in hand, and if you could only get one right, I would guess it would be the second, the marketing, that you really need to get right.
So for somebody setting out on the journey today in terms of travel blogging, what would your couple of hot tip advices, in addition to what you've just mentioned, in terms of the marketing, be for them?
Right. So I'd firstly say it depends on what your goals are. So if you're just travel blogging to keep an account for yourself, for family and friends, it's very different to if you're travel blogging as a means of income and a business. So that would be the sort of first proviso. If we're talking, are we talking more about the latter, would you say?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, so if we're talking more about the latter, I think it's important to focus on a niche and to really focus on an area that's of personal interest to you, because the more you enjoy what you write about, the more you're going to excel at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So how's the travel industry in general changed over all the years that you've been involved with it? What have been some of the most dramatic changes within the industry, would you say?
Good question. I mean, obviously the internet has been a huge factor on the travel industry in the last 20, 30 years. I think the way people book accommodation and other services, flights and so on, has fundamentally changed. I mean, obviously here in the UK, we know how that's impacted businesses such as Thomas Cook. I think they're the oldest travel agent in the world, or were the oldest, and obviously they went bankrupt. And I think that's news that hit the headlines internationally rather than just within the UK. Yeah. So the way that people operate and book travel services has fundamentally changed, and we've obviously seen the likes of Booking.com and many others like them spring up from essentially nowhere to be major players in the marketplace.
So if we filter that down to the next level and say, how has the luxury travel industry specifically changed over that period, what would your response be to that?
The amount of luxury out there has increased, and the quality within the luxury sector has increased phenomenally as well. So if I think back again to my parents' holiday cottage business, they did things really nicely. The cottages were really nicely well done and converted and so on, and they invested a lot of love and tears into creating a really good quality product. Nowadays, within the luxury industry, what I would say what they achieved is kind of second nature and expected within luxury, and people are going the extra mile beyond that, with everything from hot tubs in the garden to helipads in the ground and all sorts. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a fundamental luxury requirement. I'm just saying that there's almost a new tier of luxury out there that I think either didn't exist, or at least I wasn't aware of previously.
I wanted to talk with you about that in a little bit more detail. So what I've done is I've actually extrapolated some of the areas of the luxury travel industry so we can talk about how those things have actually evolved. Let's start with airlines and how their products have changed over the last 10 to 15 years, particularly to the high-end traveller in terms of the luxury traveller. What are some of your oversights as far as talking about how the airlines have adapted to provide more luxury for those high-end travellers?
Well, yeah, I think they've certainly made great advances in trying to offer a more premium product. So nowadays, even just the beds and the cabins and so on are much higher end, and the quality of the linen and the food and all these things they've really upped their game in terms of the product delivery. Obviously, in addition to the mainstream airlines, we've also got all the private jet air industry as well, which is a whole new world to many of us. I mean, I remember meeting somebody at a luxury travel conference a couple of years ago where I think he worked for, well, I won't say who he worked for, but he was basically dealing with a lot of Middle East clients and booking their private jets for them. And the requirements and demands being placed on them. He said that nowadays the jets that they're using, they're very, very wealthy. They're using jets that are a little bit bigger so that whatever sheik's wife can get her wardrobe into it and so basically she will fly wherever, and all her clothes will be unpacked by whoever.
Yep.
And so they were increasing the size of the private jets they were taking in order that she could take all of her clothes. And make of that what you will, because obviously in an era where we're talking about climate change and so on, I think a lot of people would sort of frown and be aghast at that kind of thing going on, but it does.
Now, we all know that time is money, so are you surprised that Concorde went out of service?
Not entirely, because they basically had structural problems, didn't they? So I think that from a safety point of view, it was a necessity. I suppose what's a little bit surprising is that there doesn't seem to be something to replace Concorde. And from my understanding, there's not something that's imminently on the horizon either to replace Concorde, from what I've read in the past.
Because when I think of those people at that higher end and that high echelon of luxury travel, I always would have thought that getting somewhere faster would have been their main aim, rather than sitting back in luxurious luxury for 19 hours flying from London to Sydney, right?
Yeah, and I think this is where the private jet industry comes in, really. So I think the people that might have travelled Concorde in the past have turned more to private jets, because you don't go through the same security controls, so you can go to small airports, drive straight to the plane, hop on. The plane might even be waiting for you rather than you waiting for the plane. And you can be at your destination and have a very seamless transfer at the other end as well. So a lot of time is saved. I guess time is saved in the air, but I think a lot of time is saved at each of the airports or airfields as well.
So I guess summarising your view on the general main airlines around the world, they've become more discerning with the products they're offering, whether it be a longer sleeper bed, better cotton sheets, etc., and all these other high-end products that they're including in their packages, yeah?
Yeah, even with showers on board and all sorts of things like that in many first-class airlines nowadays. So, yeah, you would probably not think you're in the air.
Do you have collaborators in your stable that go out there and do these high-end reviews on airlines around the world?
Yeah, I've personally done a few business class reviews for one or two airlines. So worked with All Nippon Airways, the Japanese airline, the likes of Virgin Atlantic I've worked with before as well, and BA. So yeah, one of the perks of the job, I sometimes get to fly business class, or I've only been in a private plane once, and that was just on a trip to Frankfurt one time. But that was interesting as well, because I very much got that experience of arriving at the airport and being driven to the plane, and that was quite eye-opening to see the time saving in that regard.
Now, I have an army of travel bloggers and writers and also wannabe ones listening to my show, so they'd be all very interested to find out, how does one get a gig with an airline to do an airline review? Is it determined really on the numbers of viewers that you have?
I think firstly, any would-be travel writers that are listening, by all means contact me, because we always are looking for new writers for the site. But to pass on that plug very quickly, sure. Yeah, I think really the airlines are obviously businesses at the end of the day. If they're going to give a flight away, and particularly a business class flight or a first class flight even, they want to ideally see a return on that, and so that's where your marketing and your numbers come in. So yeah. And bear in mind that they do get that. I don't usually go out to the airlines requesting those kinds of things, but thankfully I'll get asked occasionally. But bear in mind, there's a lot of people out there that write to the marketing departments of airlines, hoping to blag the same, and yeah, it'll be hard to get seen, I think.
Yeah, understandably so. Okay, we've talked about airlines. Now, what about hotels and resorts? What have they done to change their products over the years for the luxury traveller?
So again, I suppose it goes back to your own personal perception of luxury and what you might be looking for. So you've got on the one hand the likes of I'm thinking of Burj Al Arab, which is a hotel I've stayed at the one that looks like a sail in Dubai. They kind of self-declared themselves as a seven-star hotel, when actually no national tourist board scheme goes beyond 5 stars. So any 6-star or 7-star hotels you come across, they're self-accredited, which to me is a little bit meaningless. But I suppose what they're trying to, it's a marketing tactic. What they're trying to do is say, we're going beyond 5 stars here. And something like the Burj Al Arab, it's certainly like that, but it's of a different style. So some people will like that kind of luxury, others might be put off by it. So for me, it's a lovely hotel, but it's a little bit gaudy, and it's more the grand chandeliers and gold taps, but the service is incredible. And for me, that's what I look for in a hotel. And many hotels have really upped their game on that, and especially in today's era of online reviews for hotels. I think that's really made the hotels up their game, because every guest is a potential reviewer. And so I have some holiday, I have a holiday apartment myself, which I rent out, and I'm always very conscious of making sure they're as happy as possible, because I'm always conscious of that review that comes in, and
yeah,
obviously I want it to be an enjoyable experience for them as well.
Are hotels actually able, I'm thinking of the major brands of hotels, are they actually able to keep up with demand in terms of putting new properties in the market year by year?
They seem to. I mean, some of the big chains are forever developing new hotels, and there seems to be the demand for them. So, they seem to have the infrastructure to do it, and the finances. I mean, many of these hotels, they're often sort of consortiums where they might know a hotel brand that we might know is given the contract, if you like, to run that hotel for the next 10 or 20 years. They don't necessarily own the building and so on. And I guess that may help the whole financing of it and the growth of individual brands.
And through your blog, are we starting to see more and more articles coming out about hotels that are in new destinations and places that are off the main, I guess, travel radar, as far as, places like the Ice Hotel and all these sorts of things?
Yeah, certainly. I think we're obviously a world that's becoming increasingly connected, and so places that were once remote are becoming increasingly easier to get to. So yeah, we see a lot more, and as well as that, people are looking for something different. So things like the Ice Hotels are hugely popular on our site. We've mentioned them a few times. I myself went to Kazakhstan just a few months ago, and that was a really interesting experience. And there's some really high-end hotels out there as well, which in a country where I think people perceive it to be maybe quite run down, and I think there's quite a divide within Kazakhstan between the rural areas and the cities, which are actually quite forward-thinking and quite developed.
I was going to ask you about that in terms of the perception that we have of certain destinations around the world. I know that when I used to travel a lot, I used to go to places and, they're a little bit off the radar, and I'd get there and I'd go, wow, this is amazing. This is completely different than what either the mainstream media made it out to be or what I'd heard through the grapevine, And I'd talk about places like Iran and Pakistan, which are got phenomenal potential as far as tourism goes. But have you found that same thing as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there and assumptions that destinations are the same as they were reported 20 or 30 years ago, which can be hugely incorrect sometimes. And Kazakhstan is a great example here, actually, because whenever I was telling people, I'm off to Kazakhstan next week, the usual response was, don't forget to pack your mankini, thinking of Borat. And that's a classic example where people's perception of a destination is very blinkered. It was obviously what they had seen of watching Borat, which is completely. I mean, a lot of the filming of Borat was done in Romania not in Kazakhstan at all. And in fact, I think if he attempted to go to Kazakhstan, he'd get lynched. So yeah, it was. I mean, I went to the capital, which is now called. It used to be Astana, it's now called Nur Sultan, and I would say that was to try to describe it. I would describe it as a cross between somewhere like Dubai and Moscow, but that perhaps gives you a feel for. It was a pretty modern city with some still some traditions there. It's a city that's grown up really in just 10 to 20 years in the middle of a desert, where really there was just a little village, and they've built a city that's, I can't remember how many millions it's designed to accommodate, but it's still only got a fraction of its capacity at the moment. So it's a city that feels like it's got a lot of space, and some amazing buildings as well. So there's a lot of Norman Foster design buildings, and where he's been able to go to town really without any planning restrictions and so on. So,
yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, not what you would imagine from watching a Borat movie. Let's put it that way.
There you go. Put Kazakhstan on your next travel itinerary and get out there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about airlines, we've talked about hotels and resorts. What about restaurants? What have they done for the high-end luxury traveller over the last few years to evolve even further?
That's a good question. I think the level of attention to detail in restaurants, and obviously the growth and popularity of Michelin star restaurants and so on, has really, and people's perhaps increasing awareness of food and the health and basically the importance of what we eat and so on. So I think there's been again a really good increase in the quality of the product that's out there.
The last one I had on this particular list was the rise of luxury camping. Is that something that's becoming more and more evident through your collaborators as well?
Yeah, very much so. So as they also call it, glamping, so glamorous camping. Yeah, this is seen phenomenal growth, and there's a lot of places out there with varying products from sort of yurts with nice and proper beds in them and so on, to some really luxurious, they call them camps in Africa, in safari destinations and so on, and even mobile tented camps as well. And yeah, the quality of the product that's out there nowadays is second to none. It's very different to what was around 20 years ago.
So are we seeing new customers going into that field, or are we seeing people that would previously stay at high-end hotels and resorts also getting into the glamping scene?
I think both, probably. So there's people that would traditionally have gone to a luxury hotel that still actually like to experience the outdoors and so on, because obviously the two aren't mutually exclusive. I think that certainly goes on, and I think it's I don't know the figures, but it's certainly an area that's seen huge growth and demand.
Okay, I mentioned to you before we came on air today that I asked a number of my listeners to come up with some questions for you, so I'm going to rapid fire through some of those. Ready to go on those?
Yeah, go for it.
So the first one comes from Dion, who's in Bundaberg, Australia, and he asks, is there a classification of family-friendly luxury travel?
I don't think there's any sort of formal classification. There'll be lots of resources out there, and I know we've got a lot of posts on our blog that are specific to family travelers. I know there's, for example, there's a small group in the UK called Luxury Family Hotels that specifically cater for that market. I think they're largely based. I know they've got a hotel in Cornwall, and I think a few of their hotels are down that way. I'm not aware of any sort of international classification of any.
The next one comes from Jessica. She's in Montana in the United States, and she asks, do you think it's okay for kids to fly in first class?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, for me personally, one of the reasons I would say for going either business or first class is really to have just a little bit more space, and particularly I'm thinking legroom. And so children, to my mind, don't really need additional legroom. So I do have a bit of an issue with that. It's a tricky one. I mean, obviously, it's up to every individual's choice. You'd like to think that if a child is traveling first class, that something's being done to offset that. But I think it's probably good for the child to fly economy as well, and not be spoiled to that extent, personally.
Do you think some people fly first class just to get away from kids?
Possibly. It's an expensive way of just getting away from kids, but and it's by no means guaranteed as well. I don't know if any of the airlines actually prohibit children in first class. Possibly they do.
That's a good question.
But I'm not sure on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next question comes from Alice. She's in Toronto, and she asks us, or you, is the price of luxury travel across the board getting more expensive or cheaper?
And we're talking price in monetary terms there, rather than...
Yeah, monetary terms. Yeah.
So I would say... that's a really good question, actually. It's making me think. I think there are always ways to travel more affordably in luxury if you look around. So I would struggle to answer that question across the board as to whether the average 5-star hotel across the world is getting dearer or not, and how that compares with inflation. I just don't know the stats. But I would say there's always creative ways to fly in luxury, just travel in luxury in a more affordable manner. Again, there's various resources on our site about this. But simple things like traveling out of peak season. There's all sorts of tools that will help you nowadays to find cheaper flights and so on. Even just using Google Flights, you can find, you can bring up a geographical map that shows you which destinations are cheaper to fly to and when and so on. So I think it's always possible to travel in luxury in quite an affordable manner.
I realise that as we get further into this conversation today about luxury travel, this whole notion of what is luxury travel can be so different to so many different people. And therefore the impact on budget and all those other things comes with it, yeah?
Yeah, definitely. So I go back to what I said earlier, of luxury being different things to different people. There's a huge spectrum of different degrees of luxury, and also what people deem luxury to be, whether it's gold taps and chandeliers or service or just attention to detail and so on. Yeah.
Okay, good. Now the next question comes from Asmay from the Netherlands, and she asks, do you have experience where you have tours for people in wheelchairs? She's actually living in a wheelchair and she's trying to travel around the world, so she wants to know whether there are luxury tour options for people in wheelchairs.
They certainly exist. It's not something I'm very well versed in, I'm afraid, but there are luxury tour companies that cater specifically for less mobile guests and so on. So yes, it's certainly out there. Obviously, it's going to be destination dependent and so on. But if you're going to a popular destination, certainly do some Googling. I'm pretty sure that they'll exist.
So you haven't got any collaborators amongst your team that are writing on wheelchair tours?
We don't have, sadly, we don't at the moment. I did speak to another blogger recently who specialises in that area, and asked her if she wanted to get involved, but she was too busy with her own blog. So, but even as close to me here in the Lake District, there's a hill near Windermere, in fact, called Orist Head. You might know of it.
Yes.
And it was. So it was one of Wordsworth's favourite views, and
right.
They're currently working on making that more accessible. And I think there are plans in place to make that one of the fells that a wheelchair can get to the top of.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, good. Well, there's obviously room for expansion in the wheelchair industry for people writing as well as getting out there on tours as well.
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
Next question comes from Tony in Seattle, and he asks, can the hotel brands keep pace with the increasing number of luxury travellers? I guess he was reading my mind when he came
Yes,
out of that.
that's very similar. So, well, I think they can, because I think if the demand is high, we will see prices go up. So it's a supply and demand thing. Basically, they control their guest numbers by adjusting their pricing. So my short answer would be, yes, they can, by simply changing their pricing model. But if you're talking in means of just sheer construction, then I don't know all the details that go into that, but there are certainly a lot of new luxury hotels coming out every year, and some quite large ones as well.
You've only got to go to a place like Singapore to find out how many hotels you can get on a small island, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And many of these high-rise buildings, floors 10 to 20 might be a hotel, and then 20 to 30 might be offices and things like that. So.
Yeah. Okay, and the last of the listener questions today comes from Mila in Poland, and she asks, what are some of the best sites to find discounted luxury travel experiences on?
So there's lots of newsletters that you can sign up to that do cheap offers, and they're often last-minute offers. So there's a lot of that in the when it comes to flights. So I know I get one that comes into my inbox fairly regularly called Scott's Flights, which I think is more, I forget, it's more UK specific. Signing up to individual airlines is always a good idea, because you'll get alerted when they do sales and so on.
Yep.
For many signing up to mailing lists, but I'm trying to think of some of the names. I just haven't got them on the tip of my tongue.
That's okay. Have you got something on your site that I can send people to, or you can send me some links?
That's a good question. Certainly, if you go onto our site, and top right-hand corner there's a search box, and if you put in affordable luxury travel, you'll certainly get some resources there, some articles that link to various resources.
Okay, fantastic. As I said, I'm going to make sure that we pass everyone through your site today, and they'll have the links there in the show notes. So, look, we're rushed through our time, but I've got a couple of quick things that I want to ask you before I let you go today, Paul.
Sure.
Rather than the places that you have visited, what have been a couple of your most memorable travel experiences in your life to date? But besides your honeymoon, of course.
Yes, besides the honeymoon. So two trips spring to mind, actually. One, this was prior to me running the blog. I was doing my PhD is in glaciology, the study of glaciers, and I was working on a glacier in Greenland. So I spent quite a lot of time out in West Greenland, just above the Arctic Circle, near a town called Kangerlussuaq. And just being there was just an incredible experience. Unlike any other, really. You don't get any trees, so there's nothing that grows more than a few feet off the ground, which means you hear everything. You don't really hear the wind, because you only generally hear wind if it blows through trees and so on. So it's really quiet, and you get a lot of time to yourself. You see some amazing scenery and wildlife, and that was just an amazing experience being out in Greenland. I haven't been there for 20 years now, but I would love to go back with my children one day, because it's a fantastic country to visit.
Is it becoming a more popular destination?
I think the population of Greenland is only something like 55,000, I think, or 60,000, and I don't hear of many people going there at all, really. So the tourism's very underdeveloped. The town that I visited was a former US air base, and bear in mind I was 20 kilometers from this town, just inland where there was nothing.
Was that Naituq, is it? Naituq?
Sorry, that was Kangerlussuaq.
Kangerlussuaq, okay.
Yeah.
That's where they have the old US Air Force barracks into a hotel, is that right?
That's right. There is a hotel there, and some of the accommodation is just former barracks. Now, the population of that town is about 250 in the summer and 200 in the winter,
right?
Because about 50 of the residents moved to join family in Denmark. because the winters are so severe, sort of -50 and -40 and pitch black for 24 hours a day.
Yeah, right.
So not much fun. But yeah, I think whether tourism is on the increase there, I'm not sure, but it's still very underdeveloped in that regard, and I'd like to think would probably remain that way for some time to come, because that's part of the beauty and charm of it.
So, and the second experience was?
The second experience, I was fortunate enough to be invited on a trip or an expedition that Land Rover were running, and it was a part expedition and part an actual test of their vehicles. It was a hybrid Range Rover, and they had 3 prototypes that they were driving all the way from Solihull in Birmingham in the UK to eventually to Mumbai in India, driving along the Silk Route. And
brilliant.
I not only did I get to go on this trip, I got paid to go on this trip, which was even a bonus. And I got to choose which leg of the trip I wanted to go on. The whole trip they were spending, I think it was something like 55 days doing the entire trip. And I got to join a 10-day leg from Kathmandu in Nepal to right across Nepal to New Delhi. And that was an amazing trip, just seeing the landscapes. Even at the onset, we got to go on a flight over Everest. And then we travelled in these vehicles, myself and other journalists driving them. And these vehicles were equipped with data loggers reporting information back to the UK about how they were handling the terrain and so on. And we got to stop in some amazing places, not necessarily what many people might perceive as luxury, but to go on a trip of that nature, I would class as a luxury in itself, and just an opportunity that's not afforded to many people. And the people were a joy, especially the children who would sort of come running out of their houses to greet us with huge smiles on their faces, even though they were obviously in many cases in poverty, really. But they seemed to be some of the happiest children I've ever come across the world. And it was just a very humbling experience to go on a trip of that nature.
That's why I always like to ask my guests what is their most memorable travel experiences, rather than saying what's the favourite place you've been to, because when you talk like you just have, you can actually feel that experience and how it impacted you.
Yeah, and that my stock answer to that question of what's my favourite place in the world is actually home, because I do live in a lovely part of the world, and actually just to spend some time at home sometimes is really enjoyable as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Couple of things. Sustainable travel. I read a report the other day that 55% of global travellers are more determined to make sustainable travel choices. What's happening in the luxury travel sector around sustainability at the moment?
So, I mean, obviously the luxury travel industry does come in for some flack when it comes to sustainability and responsible travel. But depending on where you look, some of the luxury travel industry is very much at the forefront of sustainability in terms of the building materials that they might use, the sourcing of food and so on, and in terms of air miles and so on, and recycling of waste and all these kinds of issues. So I think it gets sometimes an undeserved bad press. That's not to say that there's not many improvements that all sectors of the industry can make, and I think a lot's being done in that regard. There's obviously always more that can be done, but it is an important issue that people do need to wake up to and pay attention to. And I do like to think that some areas of the luxury travel industry actually sort of pioneer the way in this regard.
How has travel changed you over the years, Paul?
I think I love travel, and I think it's really given me a better outlook on the world, and a less blinkered view of what's out there. What I particularly enjoy when I travel is traveling with my family and seeing my kids experience different cultures and so on, because obviously that's a journey I've gone through myself, and I think travel is is one of the best forms of education and so on. And in fact, I know of many bloggers who do actually are pretty much nomadic and teaching their children on the move. And I think some children learn so much from traveling the world. I personally wouldn't use that as a method to replace a proper formal schooling, but I think it complements school education really, really well.
So where to next for Paul Johnson and the Luxury Travel Blog?
In a couple of weeks, my children both go off on a ski trip to Davos, but it's a school ski trip, so we don't get to go. Although my wife's a teacher, she did get to go a couple of years ago. So we're using the opportunity to have a few days in Ireland, actually. So I have wonderful. A travel conference in Dublin that I'm attending, and then we're just spending a few more days in Ireland whilst we're there.
Paul, it's been amazing having you on the show today, and I'd really like to get you back at some stage because there's a ton of other things that we can talk about. But
thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
You've made my 100th episode very special, so I want to really show my appreciation for that. So thanks for coming on the show today.
Mark.
Yeah, and as I say, I'd love to get you back, and there's lots more to talk about. I'm sure that my listeners are going to be stimulated to ask a lot of more questions after they listen to this particular episode as well. So until next time, Paul, thanks for coming on the Global Travel Channel podcast show.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Paul Johnson from luxurytravelblog.com was my guest on the show today, and as you heard, there are many things happening in the global expansion of the luxury travel industry. I hope you enjoyed that show and you learned something new about travel blogging, but also about the luxury travel industry. If you've got a view or something you want to get some more information on, drop me a note, and I'll also put the show notes here so that you can contact Paul via his website. Maybe you want to be a collaborator for a luxury travel blog. If you're looking for more episodes from the Global Travel Channel podcast show, head over to our website at www.globaltravelchannel.com. You can also download our show from places like iTunes under the podcast section, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and even from our Patreon page. So check all out the links on our website and you can gain easy access to that. If you love our shows, why not tell a friend, a family member, or even a work colleague about the Global Travel Channel podcast show? We're trying to grow our reach across the world, so the more that you can tell people to help us out would be fantastic. Okay, well that's it for me for this particular episode. My name is Mark Philpott, and until we meet again next time, I wish you all a very happy and safe bon voyage.